Hello, everyone, and welcome to What Fresh Hell Laughing in the Face of Motherhood. This is Margaret.
And this is Amy, and today we're talking to Amanda Montei, author of the new book Touched Out, which we'll be discussing today. Amanda has a PhD in literature and teaches writing at Stanford, plus a number of literary organizations. You can find her every week at her popular Substack, Mad Woman, where Amanda writes about books and culture with a feminist lens. Amanda is also the mother of 2 children. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So touched out, it's one of those terms
Yeah.
that we all know what it means. You know what it means when you see it, when you feel it, but let's really define it. What does it tend to mean in our society?
Yeah, it's great. Actually writing this book too, I thought that sort of everybody knew this term, but I've found that some, especially non-parents, are not as familiar with
all
this term.
moms know the term in their bones,
I know, right?
even if they don't know that they know it. They're like, touched out. I know exactly what
I know
mean.
what that is. Right.
Yes. And then you describe it. Oh, yeah. Okay. No, I know what this is. Yes. So, yeah, I mean, it really became this commonly used term, I think, over the past decade. So I became a parent in 2015 and I started hearing this term. But it's kind of yes, it is this term that provides a lot of recognition, I think, for a lot of moms who feel sensory overwhelm, who feel like their body has reached a limit. There's often descriptions of the kids tugging on them, feeling like you want to jump out of your skin, crawling out of your skin, all the bad feelings about the skin. But I think that when I learned this term, I felt like there was kind of a lot missing there because in the mid 2010s, a lot of the discourse around this term was this is totally normal. It's totally just a part of becoming a mom. And that really did not sit well with me.
Because it's an end. It's like a thought terminating thing, right? Yep, that's a thing.
Totally.
Go deal with it.
Right. And I think, part of that was that there was this urge to sort of destigmatize feeling this way. Right. Because as moms, any negative feeling that we might have in parenting is something that we're taught to kind of secret away. Right. And so it makes sense that we were kind of trying to normalize this thing. Okay, yes, sometimes you are going to feel like you don't want to be touched by your children or your partner, which maybe we can get into as well, which is another layer to this term. But, ultimately, yeah, we need to sort of move past that thought of why are mothers feeling this way, right? And why have we come to accept it as just this sort of normal part of parenting?
It's interesting because even in picking up this book, I read the title and I was like, oh, it's touched out. I'm picturing a harried mom on the cover, and it's
right.
When I just can't stand it anymore. And it's really not that kind of book at all. It's a deep work look at our relationship with our own bodies, the world's relationship with our bodies, our parents, our partners, other people's relationship with our bodies, that this is really much deeper than I just can't take it anymore. And that's kind of what Amy said. It's not enough to just dismiss this term as I'm a hot mess mom and I'm touched out. It's not quite at that level.
Totally. Yes. Thank you for saying that. Yeah. And I mean, I think there's that assumption whenever you write a quote unquote mom book, which is to say just a book about motherhood, that it's going to be as I always think of it, jazz hands, right?
Yes.
Okay, moms, let's talk about how we feel, touched out. And it's really trivializing. And I think for me, I felt like this was a cultural phenomenon that we needed to take a little bit more seriously.
Because after the touched out thing, right, is the guilt that comes, the sort of second arrow of it all is, and I'm not supposed to feel this way, especially with our partners, that there's this shame that we're not going to be able to give 100% of ourselves and maybe the way we used to before we were breastfeeding 6 hours a day. But then we also feel bad about that, right? We're at the end of our rope, and then we also ugh, but I really got to get it together. I feel like that's the hardest part of what's hard about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a trivializing discourse that sort of hovers around this, but there's also a lot of what I found online, these really painful stories, and usually there was always kind of a common narrative, right? Of a mom staying home, staying home alone, taking care of her kids. And then at the end of the day, her partner comes home and she really wants to have nothing to do with it. Usually it's sort of like a cis hetero partnership. And that was also very troubling for me, right? Like, what is this sort of element of sexual duty that's factoring in? And as you said, Amy, like this feeling of shame around a pretty normal response to being touched all day by a child. So yeah, a lot of the book is also sort of digging into how can we look at this cultural phenomenon and connect it to a lot of what we've been talking about in feminist politics, over the past decade or so, as far as male entitlement to women's bodies.
And it's deep in the like medical jargon or the medical starting point that like, okay, 6 weeks is when you can resume sexual activity because a doctor has looked at parts and pieces and said like, okay, everything's just about healed enough that it's a green light. And that's not the starting point for a lot of women. And it's just like this inherent thing of like, okay, you're good to go. So now you should be breastfeeding and not sleeping and also getting back to intimacy with your partner. And that is your baseline expectation when you wake up in the morning.
Right. And also like the burning question that you have at 6 weeks, like when realistically, we want to know how we're doing psychologically, emotionally, physically, in other ways, like the centrality of, the sexual green light at 6 weeks is something, tells us a lot about
worth investigating. Yeah.
Worth investigating for sure.
And then there's like another part of this about being touched out that we actually just need physical space.
Yeah.
A room of our own, right? And we all felt this much more, I think, during the pandemic, but it was an intensification of something that was always there, right? Like we don't, the space that we exist in is not our own.
Yeah. I mean, part of this sort of like touched out phenomenon is that women are describing their body, like a toy, like a snot rag. It's just this thing to be used and sort of, trampled on. And, I write in the book about working at a in-home daycare. And what I learned there is that there's definitely a degree of, filth and fluid and fury, like just constant
filth, fluid, and fury. The story of American daycares.
Alliteration. Yeah. Should have been the subtitle, right? Yeah. I mean, caregiving is like, it's a very sensory, physical experience, right? But when we're doing it all alone with no support, which of course is what was happening during the pandemic and which, triggered a lot of memories of early parenthood for, parents who had older kids at the time.
Yeah.
When we're doing it all alone, of course, our body becomes this kind of tool. There's nothing else around for kids to use.
Right.
So,
and it's a play jungle gym, right? Like it's just a constant physical touch. The book is very personal and full of personal stories. And I think one of the things that, as I came in expecting kind of a different book, the idea that motherhood is a reckoning with our own bodies and our own history within our bodies is something that was kind of, I mean, we read a lot of books and talk to a lot of people for this podcast, and it's been a while since I had a like falling from the horse, like, oh, kind of moment. And I think we talk a lot about the reckoning with how we were parented, the reckoning with maybe our own experience as children or watching our own parents in terms of parenting. But this reckoning with like the physical experiences of our body, can you talk a little bit about how you talk about that in the book? Because for me, it was very eye-opening.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like I said, parenting is, inherently physical, but the sort of like knockabout nature of American intensive parenting is keyed up, so much. So it is really confronting, to have your body, tugged at constantly to, have your, naked body stared at, by your children, especially if those things have happened before, with experiences with, men or other, sexual partners in ways that, left a mark, or caused you to feel like your sense of autonomy or consent were violated.
Mm.
And I think that experience is pretty common for women. We have like this very limited set of terms for talking about, sexual violence, like rape, assault, harassment. Like there's just like 3 levels, right?
Mm.
But in reality, we're catcalled. We're from a young age, if we're socialized as girls, we are taught that our bodies are objects for other people's pleasure. And so to get into a situation where then you're performing that as a parent, all that unresolved stuff tends to or can really bubble up.
We're
And so
talking
for
to,
me, that's
finish your thought.
what that touched out feeling is. It's all that stuff sort of riling up and wait, am I allowed to say no? Like what
Mm.
have I ever been allowed to say no?
Mm. It goes deep.
We're
Yeah.
talking to Amanda Montei. Her new book is called Touched Out, and we'll be right back. So, Amanda, there's a quote in the book that I saved to talk to you about because I thought, we never want to say, as we often do, like, if you feel touched out, then that's something for you to fix and deal with and change, right? That's not something for the world that's for you to figure out. But there are ways in which we contribute to this. And I'm
Totally.
quoting something from the book. You said, I still believed that laying myself down on the train tracks to be railroaded by my child or on the floor as train tracks so her daughter could run her caboose over my back was the best way to parent. It hadn't occurred to me to consider what other lessons I was teaching my daughter in the process. So let's talk about how we think like we are not only supposed to put up with this, but we're better if we are putting up with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I do talk a little bit about this sort of era of intensive parenting that, we're living in, which again is another way in which we're sort of ramping up the pressure on mothers, psychologically, emotionally, in terms of labor. And I write about really buying into that, and feeling like I did have to make my body available to my child 24/7 for them to not be, I know I'm not supposed to curse, messed up,
Mm. Yeah.
to not irreparably damage them. I also write about being like really invested in attachment parenting, which is very like late 2010s. And now, of course, we have like the sort of gentle parenting backlash that's happening. And I think that's not because we don't want to be gentle with our children or we don't want to give them everything that we have to give, right? But that it's all a little too much, right? And it's all putting pressure on mothers and not a community or another adult. And I think that we can explore how we are invested in those ideologies that say, mothers are going to suffer for a couple years. They're going to give up their identity and everything that they believe in. And we can push back against that.
We sometimes say it's like these simple ideas can be extremely radical. Like the idea that I feel like the imagery around this that we all see that I've never even really thought to question, which is like, the mom with like, I mean, I've taken this picture for promos for the podcast, right? For my old blog. Like I had the baby on the hip and another one crawling into my face and the house is a mess. And well, you've never seen that image of a male ever, ever. I mean, try to think of an image of, a man who's like, I had kids and now like my whole life is over and everything's fallen apart. And like, it's okay to have people crawling all over me all the time. And this is the new reality. It's so standard to what we believe about motherhood.
It is. It is. It's so central to the image of the American mom that it's hard to imagine something else. But I mean, if we just think about it for a minute, like, where is everybody else in this picture?
Right. Right.
It's just the mom. And literally, as you described it, right? Like the kids descending on her, and where is anyone else helping her?
And it does seem, I mean, it's, as I think back, like it does seem historically that this is played out through history, right? That like I picture like a picture of Irish mom in the 1800s. It's like she's like feeding the cow and has the 10 kids all around. So it's not something that's like, where is it coming from? Is it layered on by society, or is it just sort of, we think it's fundamental to the experience?
Yeah. I mean, I think both, and at least like the Irish mom with the cow is like outside, right?
Yes.
It's usually when we get the American mom, she's like sitting on the couch, right? She's at home. Why is she trapped? Why is she always trapped at home? And I think that, it's a cultural image that just is sort of like self-perpetuating. It's definitely coming from our belief in sort of parenting expert advice, which is so all consuming now, that especially with the internet, the amount of that advice that we're getting, and the very American tendency to look to experts rather than to kind of look to our family systems or our communities or ourselves to explore how we might want to parent. And I think, as I explore in the book, I think we also need to situate the question of, this sort of entitlement to women's work in the home next to this sort of broader exploration of male entitlement to women's bodies. Because it says a lot, right? That image of the mom, being descended upon, right? About who we think women's bodies are for and what we think they're for.
Yeah. And you're young. I'm thinking about being, a young woman, not having had kids yet, and you're getting catcalled every time you walk down the street. And now I'm a different age woman, having had a couple of kids, having a body that looks like I've had a couple of kids, and not getting catcalled. And then you feel bad about that, right? Like that, like your body is for other people to use and judge, and you are measuring yourself up to how well you're performing whatever part of that job you're supposed to be performing at that moment.
Right. And usually the job is to, make yourself into an object for male consumption, or, to serve the nuclear family, which historically, serves men and male power, in the form of being a mom. Right. And that's supposed to be the sort of like ultimate, self-actualization for women, is to be moms, kind of serving the nuclear family.
And if you ever question any of this, I think it's sort of put back on you like, well, if you didn't want to put up with this, what'd you have kids for? Right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
And you get to do both. You get to be a good parent and say some of this seems a little unfair.
Totally. Absolutely. Yeah. I completely reject the idea that like critiquing, the institution of the family, or, critiquing our cultural expectations of mothers, or our political abandonment of mothers in terms of policy, like paid leave and affordable childcare, has really anything to do with our love for our children. I think becoming more aware of the limits of my body, or just what I want, my own desire, my own sense of self, has made me such a better parent. And it shouldn't all be about that, right? It should also be about us as people, women as people. But yeah, it only, strengthens our relationships when they feel more consensual and caring. Yeah.
Right, and it's not like a zero-sum game at some point,
No.
it's like it's like if you don't throw yourself on the funeral pyre, you don't love your husband enough, you don't throw yourself on this burning pile of debris. It doesn't mean you don't love your kids. It means
Right.
that, like, you have an autonomous place from which to love your kids, which I think that permission to find that space for yourself. And we did talk a lot about this in the pandemic in terms of like so many of our listeners were writing in and being like, I had one little sewing station, that was my little special place. And it was like, shh, throw that off the table. Now
Right.
that's going to be the kid's desk for home learning
Right.
or whatever. That it's not really a question of how much we want to give, and we want to give in love to kids. It's that we
Right.
don't want to just take chunks of ourselves, right? And offer that to the world because that's the default.
Right. Totally. Yeah, totally. And I mean, sometimes that's survival mode, right? Like you got to make space in the house where you can get it. I mean, another thing here too that I explore in the book is this question of choice, right? And I think
Yes.
people get really prickly when talking about choice. They really want to believe that either you have a choice or you don't have a choice, right? Are
Right.
you saying that women don't have a choice? And so that, to Amy's point, is where this sort of weaponization of choice against women comes up, right? Oh, well, you chose to have a parent. You should have known this, right? Like if you're poor, that must have been a choice that you made, right? If if you don't have the resources to give yourself a sense of freedom and, be a parent, well, you made that choice, right? It's on you. But that's just not how it works. That's not how choice works. This is just coming from this very American sense of free will, right? That
Right.
we just completely,
Your
create
destiny
our
is in
own
your own
destiny.
hands. Yep.
Exactly. Yeah. And, we know that's not true. Like agency, choice, these things have always been conditioned along the lines of class and race and gender. And so there's ways that I've been able to create agency in my life that other people might not, and even people with an immense amount of privilege, they're still, living under the influence of culture and politics and history, So I think it's worth us just exploring choice as this more complex concept and agency as this more complex concept so that we can create spaces that do feel more consensual.
Yeah.
To a range of people and families.
Well, in part 3, we always turn to solutions. So that's what we're going to talk about next. The solutions are not necessarily easy, but we will be back to discuss them. We're talking to Amanda Montei, the author of Touched Out. Okay. So we've had the scales fall from our eyes. We see that this default of this is just our destiny as moms is maybe something worth questioning and finding some more autonomy for ourselves and changing our stories around this. How do you start to find, as Amy likes to say, some of this stuff feels so deeply baked in the cake? Like, how are we disentangling ourselves personally from this? And then maybe how connected to that is untangling it on a societal level?
Yeah. I mean, I think it is deeply baked into the cake that we're all eating every day. So it is tricky. And, my background is in narrative and literature. So this book is, it's not that here's the problem and here's my solution.
Right. Here's your 8-point plan for
you got it for $27.
You can crush
said that in one of your interviews.
Anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
Amanda, you actually said in one of your interviews, I thought it was with Anne Helen Peterson. You said you got to the end of the book and you're like, a really good ending would be if I sailed away on a boat, but I'm not going to do that. So what's the ending here?
Totally. And that's I think that's kind of a, a trend now in the genre too of women blowing up their lives, which is great. I mean, I'm all for it. Right. But also that's not necessary. Right. For some people, right. For some people it is. Right. Yeah. So I was really resistant to providing any sort of false solutions here. But I do talk in the book about, bringing men into childcare. And this is something that historically, has not happened globally. And so I think it's interesting, curious that we're not talking more about this. Yes, there is a great conversation happening now around bringing men into the work that happens inside the home. But, over 90% of childcare providers are women. Half of them are women of color. I think we really need, that's kind of the next frontier, right? Is really digging into why are men not in professional childcare. But I think on sort of the more individual level, acknowledging that, yes, we're always told, to fix it ourselves, that, we're going to fix, living under the thumb of patriarchy in our homes. For me as a parent, passing on a language of consent and autonomy to my kids is crucially important. It's like the path from which all others diverge. If I can teach them to respect other people's bodies, that's great. I won parenting.
How do you go about
in my
modeling
book.
that? Give us an example of how you might talk about that with your kids. And how old are your
I mean,
children too?
My kids are 5, almost 6, and 8. So yeah, we talk about bodies all the time. We talk about not commenting on other people's bodies. We talk about asking before, the basic stuff, asking before hugs and touch. And, as they get older, these conversations get increasingly complicated.
Mhm.
But, as I write in the book, like I started with the wry parenting stuff of, I am going to pick you up now. Here is what we're doing. Right. And then as they get bigger, it gets more complicated. But I also model that, like, I have a sense of autonomy, right? I need space, mommy's body needs a little break right now. And I don't really carry guilt around that anymore, because I know that it's teaching them a really valuable lesson about their own bodies. I think another sort of main question in this book is, how do we separate ourselves from, the institution of motherhood, using Adrienne Rich's terms, which is like all this stuff that we've been talking about, all these expectations and assumptions, all this sort of history that we're, kind of mired in. And I think we can't completely remove ourselves from this world, but we can continue to ask, why am I doing this? Why do I feel like I need to let my kid jump on my face right now? Or why am I feeling like really frustrated and itchy? What is it that maybe I need? And just to sort of get curious about why we're doing the things that we're doing. Is it a cultural compulsion? Is it that image of the mom that we think we need to play out? Or is it something we really want?
You point out in the book that maternal touch aversion has been studied a little, but not that much. There hasn't been that much on it. Do you think that that's a shortcoming of the scientific community, or do you think because in the end it is more metaphorical than, this amount of touch is acceptable and then this is too much?
Oh, for sure. I think it's a deficit in the research. Yeah. There's very minimal research on postpartum mental health in general, and so we definitely, need more of that. There's the, resources allocated for women's mental health in general, or even physical health, is disappointing to say the least. Right. But that doesn't mean that, like, women aren't having these experiences, and that they're not worth digging into, both how we talk about them, but also, the metaphor of feeling touched out can also be like a lived experience, like, wow, I really feel like my body's being used as an object. That can be really triggering, because we felt that before.
It seems to me like the naming of it, just for people and for moms in our audience, is the most useful part of the exercise. Like, this is not just like, you're touched out, go get a manicure, you need self-care. Like, we're not having the discussion on the level of like, here's your 8-point plan. It's really a deeper dive into like the way we have lived in our bodies is coming into a reckoning in this motherhood, and trying to be a spouse and a partner and a sexual partner and a mother all at the same time. And that feeling is very deeply valid. It's not just valid in terms of like, and here's the 4-point plan to fix it. That like, this is something that's real. I feel like it's 90% of the battle.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, yes, it is a normal reaction. But it's not a feeling that we have to allow ourselves to have all the time. And, for me, the better question is what has been my relationship in my body with consent? What's been my relationship with desire and my own wants and needs? And what is my relationship right now? And do I maybe need to sit with those questions and see why motherhood is bringing all this stuff up. I love the term reckoning. Because it is this sort of, wait a minute.
Right. And what's been my relationship with sublimating my own needs for the needs of other people who want access to my body?
Right.
That is a question that I think in all the questions we have talked about in the many years of doing this, that we have not really had a discussion around that. And it's very eye-opening, I think.
Totally. Yeah. And I feel like, mothers should belong to themselves. Right. And there's this interesting, I wrote a piece for the New York Times about who does a mother's body belong to, and being pregnant and realizing it felt like it belonged to strangers who were telling me how to eat and what I shouldn't be buying at the grocery store, and then having kids, you have people commenting on what you're doing or wearing or whatever. But, I think mothers' bodies should belong to themselves. And that doesn't mean that we can't also feel a sense of that sort of loving belonging with our children and our families and our communities. But I think that those experiences are richer when we also feel like our bodies belong to us.
You made a beautiful point in the book, and I'm going to paraphrase it now. I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it was about how love is truly love when it's consensual.
Yeah.
That's when it's truly felt, when it's freely given. I thought, that's it.
Yeah, totally. And I think this book is a lot about love. It's about looking at our children and realizing there's a barrier coming up here within me, but it doesn't feel like it has anything to do with them, with the kids. And so allowing ourselves to sort of explore what are those barriers that are coming up and purge them to an extent, allows us to, create this more consensual form of love, and not trying to romanticize it too much. Of course, like I said, not all of us have the choice to slow down, take a beat, do all this hard internal work, right? Some folks are just working and trying to put dinner on the table, but we would hope that, everyone could have access to this kind of important reflection, on their bodies and
being validated, right? It's such a beautiful book because it's such a skillful combination of really personal memoir and really hard-hitting research. And it's such an eye-opening read, as you said, Margaret. And I really, really enjoyed this book. Amanda Montei's book is called Touched Out. Amanda, tell us where our listeners can find more about you and what you're working on.
Yeah, you can find the book everywhere. I just finished my book tour, so I am totally burnt out, gonna reconnect with my body now. Talked out. Yeah, talked out.
Toured out.
Actually really excited to snuggle with my kids because I've been spending so much time away from them. But you can find me, at my newsletter, Mad Woman, on Substack. I've been actually really enjoying digging in there since the book tour. And I'm always teaching. You can find me on Instagram, not on Twitter. I am over it.
Twittered out.
Yeah, but you can find me at Instagram at Montei.
Thanks so much for talking to us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Amanda.